Bright light. As you heard, this is the second time I've done one of these talks. The first one was, I think, about 15 months ago. And by the end of it, I was pretty much suicidal. So I'm hoping this one goes a little better. So my last talk, I went through photographs that I'd done. For 10 years, I'd worked as a humanitarian photographer, documenting the stories of people who were struggling with conflicts, with humanitarian disasters, lesser known stories that maybe got missed by the media. Most of my work was self-funded. I traveled from Angola to Congo, to Sudan, to Bangladesh, to Ukraine, telling the stories, documenting those who'd had horrific experiences. So at my last talk, I went through these photographs, and all I kept thinking was I would never get to do them again, that I would never get to work again. Because at the time I did my last talk, I was less than a year after getting blown up in Afghanistan. It was one of the first times I'd actually been out of hospital when I came to do the talk. I was in my wheelchair. We were speaking at the Amnesty Centre and their lift wasn't working. And I remember everybody had to help lift me in the wheelchair to get on stage. And then I sat on the stage going through my work, the work that I've really given up my life to do. And with each picture, I kept thinking, I would never be able to do that again. I would never be able to do that again. Then, when we left afterwards, I went with my girlfriend and we tried to get a drink in a pub, but we couldn't get the wheelchair in. Then we tried to get a taxi home and we couldn't get the wheelchair in a taxi. Then when we got home, we couldn't get the wheelchair through the door of her flat and I had to crawl on the floor and crawl upstairs. All the time I kept thinking, my life is over. Everything I've ever wanted to do is over. And I genuinely wanted to die at that point. So this talk is a little bit about perceptions of people and possibilities for people. So I want to remember what I was just saying, how I felt completely worthless in society. I felt I had no role anymore, that I would be nothing but a burden to other people, that I would never be able to learn a living, I would never be able to do anything that was worthwhile. But I was lucky. I had a combination of incredible medical facilities. I was born at a time in this country where society's perceptions of disability was completely different. I had an incredible family that supported me, and I was born with a very strong, stubborn streak. So, 6 months after I did the talk, at the point where I thought I had no hope, I found myself at the Paralympics working again. I have to tell you a slightly funny story just to lighten the mood a bit here. I was working for a company that does the prosthetic limbs at the Paralympics. And when I turned up there was a media entrance. And the very helpful games helpers were there. And they saw me queuing with all the other journalists and photographers. And I had my shorts on and they could see my legs. And they kept coming over going, "Sir, you're in the wrong queue." No, this is my queue. And there was the athletes' entrance over there. I kept saying, "No, sir, you need to go this way." I was like, no. As my girlfriend said, it must have been my obvious sportsman physique. But anyway, after about a half an hour of the very friendly, overly friendly games helpers, I gave up and said, okay, I'll go that way. It happened that the whole Chinese Paralympic team turned up at the same time. So I got swamped by a lot of men in red tracksuits who were looking as confused as I was about being with them. I've got a photograph with the whole Chinese Paralympic team. I'm somewhere in the background. There were kids singing to us, and I got given garlands and all the rest of it. In my mind, I kept thinking, what event shall I do? But the point is, working at the Paralympics, taking these photographs, was an incredible moment. Now, I think it's fair to say, sometimes the Paralympics can overdo the idea of these superhumans. Obviously, most people with amputations, most people with disabilities cannot attain these goals. But what it did set was the possibilities. To see children going around in wheelchairs, to see children with heavy disabilities going around the Paralympic Park, seeing the athletes, seeing the work they were doing, and thinking one day they could do something like that was incredibly inspiring. So this was just a stage for me. The next stage was to return to Afghanistan, to return to the work that I really love. So in November of last year, I returned to document civilians caught up in the war. I'd actually been planning to do that story 2 years ago. I was in Sudan with a guy that runs a charity called Emergency, Gino Strada, an incredible man who looks more like an Italian movie star with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth even as he comes out of surgery. But he told me about the work that they were doing with civilians in Afghanistan, and I made the promise that I would go there and document it. Unfortunately, I lost my legs on the way, and so it took me a bit longer than I intended. But I managed to make good on my promise and return to Afghanistan to document the lives of those who were just like me, but didn't have the opportunities I had. Here is me with one of those guys. This is Saeed. Now, I have to say, I'm not sure why I'm standing like that in this photograph. It's a very strange pose. But he was one of the people I met there. He was a stonemason. He'd been driving to work when his vehicle hit an IED and he lost both his legs. Now, not once did I ever hear him complain about his injuries, complain about the pain that I know he must be in, because I am in pain every day and I know what it's like. He didn't complain about the fact that he wouldn't be able to move around much himself. All he talked about was his family of 8, his mother, his disabled brother, and his children, and who was going to support them now. Because he knew that once he returned, he'd probably never get out of this wheelchair. The society would look on him in a different way. He'd never be able to work as a stonemason again, and that meant his whole family would be destitute. This is Muhammad Ali. He'd been shot in the leg. He hadn't been treated for nearly 3 weeks before he finally got to the emergency hospital in Kabul. By the time he got there, the septic wound was too bad. They couldn't do anything. This is him receiving the news that his leg is going to be amputated. His father had to make the final decision, because although Muhammad Ali was an adult, the person who will look after you has to make the final decision. As his father said, it was like giving his son a death sentence. Because once his leg was removed, he would not be able to work, nobody would marry him, and he would be left destitute. This is me talking to a man whose son was in the operating theatre, who lost his fingers after picking up an explosive device. But the reason I'm showing you this photograph is because this was me back at work. This was me doing what I love doing. It's funny, but if you're doing what you love doing, if you're doing your job, if I'm, for me, taking photographs and doing them relatively well, I'm a photographer, we're always a bit negative about our own work, but I'm doing okay with it. Do I have a disability? I look after myself, I live independently, nobody does anything for me. I can drive myself, I can fly to Afghanistan, walk around, take photographs. I have been lucky because the perception in this country meant that people believed that would be possible. People thought I could be able to do anything. I was lucky because the medical facilities in this country gave me the cutting-edge stuff to be able to walk with. I was lucky because I had family that was able to support me, a society that was able to support me. So all these people we've seen here before, think of what I was describing when I said I did my last talk here. How I felt I just wanted to die because I had no worth, because I had no future. That's what each one of these people is left at that point. It's one thing to fix people in an emergency operating theatre, but if you do not give those people a life, you are actually giving them a death sentence. In ways, it is worse than letting them die. Their families are often left destitute. Their lives are in so many ways over. We have to give people their lives back. In Afghanistan, we have spent, or the Western allies have spent close to 600 billion fighting that war. Yet we haven't built one functioning hospital. Here's a young boy that I met on the last day I was there. Atola. He was 7 years old when he was walking to school and he stepped on a landmine. He immediately lost his leg and one arm. He never lost consciousness, though. His cousins found him, took him to his father. His father borrowed a car, and they drove for 20 hours to reach the hospital in Kabul. During that whole period, apparently he never moaned, never complained, just lay in the back of the car quietly. This is him being fitted with a prosthetic arm. Now, I just want you to ask yourself, what is his future? What will his life be? He lives out in the country. Everyone around him is a farm labourer or works in the fields. He won't be able to do any of those things. His father can't afford for him to have a proper education. He lives so far away that this was the first time he'd even had a prosthetic arm fitted, even though it had been nearly 2 years since his injuries. What future does he have? That's how I'd like to leave it tonight. Thank you.